Why did you get fired? Story 1, I've been fired twice in my life. First time, I was working part-time at a sawmill and put in my 2-week notice since the school year was ending and I had a summer job lined up. I was fired on the spot. Second time, I was T-boned while making a delivery for a GM dealership I was working at. The other driver was deemed at fault. They said it will raise their insurance costs and fired me. Didn't lose sleep over either firing. They were not careers I was wanting to pursue. Story 2. I communicated with a client that I had always kept the lines of communication open with because none of the higher-ups would ever respond to their questions. I had just had a performance review giving me perfect scores and commending me for maintaining such a positive relationship with this client. I had never been written up before, no PIPs, corrective action plan in my 5 years there ever. 2 weeks after my perfect performance review, I was put in a PIP for communicating with the client. It was standard conversation, just the type of convo we had always so that we could make sure the project was performing as planned and that deadlines were going to be met. I guess my critical mistake was having a conversation with my boss to keep her in the loop, that the client relationship was fine and we were good. My very first PIP was a final warning. I had a new job 3 days later, and my previous employer got mad at me because they lost the client and the account when I left because they knew the only person who ever communicated with them was gone. My new job included a $30,000 raise, so no complaints here, but I was pissed at the time. It just felt extremely unfair. Story 3. Because my boss told me some she wasn't supposed to and then got rid of me, presumably out of fear that I would report her. I got fired, but the joke's on her because I reported her as well. Nuclear option, baby. Mutually assured destruction. Story 4. Okay, so hear me out. This was technically my fault, but also kind of not. I used to work at this cute little boutique, and one day a customer came in being super rude, like yelling at me because we were out of some scarf she wanted. I stayed polite, but when she said, "I'm never shopping here again," I just replied, "Okay, have a nice day." Apparently that was too much sass, and my manager fired me for not diffusing the situation. Honestly, no regrets retail is wild, and I'm happier now working somewhere with less drama. Story 5. A nonprofit hired me to be a full-time grant writer, but it quickly became clear that they didn't understand how the grant process worked. They thought I could just send a letter and say, "We need a new printer. Money, please." I tried to explain that grant funders were only really interested in funding projects that would have measurable impact on the nonprofit's clients. But every project I proposed, they said no. They didn't have time or staff to spare. While this was going on, they fired their director of communications. That was my previous job title, and I had loads of experience. My resume matched everything they needed, but when I asked to transfer to that position, they said no, with no explanation. Finally, they just ended the grant writer position. They ended up firing me right before Christmas. Nice folks, huh? Story 6. I took a job that wasn't a good fit for me because of the high pay, but the long hours, long commute, and monotonous work quickly made me hate it. Because of that, I didn't really give and was a poor performer and was eventually let go. That was my money isn't everything lesson. I took a lower-paying job with a much shorter commute and better hours and was much happier. Plus, it had more growth opportunity. Story 7. I got fired from Wendy's. Baked potatoes were a brand new thing. They took a long time to cook, so you really had to guesstimate how many you'd need in an hour. I was a manager, and we had just gotten a new owner. Another manager, female, who I had previously dated, had gotten chummy with him. Anyway, I miscalculated and we ran out of potatoes. Bad? Yes. I wasn't the only one this had happened to, though. We were still on a learning curve. I get home and get a phone call to come back and pick up my check. I go back, and the other manager is gloating. I had stopped seeing her and started dating a young blonde cutie, and this was her revenge. Joke's on her. I married the cutie, and we have 3 daughters and 5 grandkids now. Story 8, long rant incoming. I was working at a nonprofit in D.C. They courted me from another position promising a $20K raise, better hours, more responsibility, and more autonomy to make needed changes. Within a month, I knew it was a mistake. I stuck it out because my manager was a friend and clearly needed help. The salary was as promised, so that's nice, but the hours were insane, usually 50+ HRS per week, and the autonomy wasn't there. The team I was supposed to manage was told I wasn't managing anyone. I was just another member of the team. The changes I suggested during interviews and the interviewers were excited about were shot down by team members. Training was non-existent, and I was met with constant pushback on everything. When I didn't know how they did things / how systems worked, I was given bare-bones explanations and expected to figure it out. When I didn't figure it out perfectly, my teammates would complain to my manager, friend. My manager would call me 3-4 nights a week after 8/9 p.m. crying about the environment, saying, "Everyone, just do your job. These people suck." It was horrible. After a few months, my wife became pregnant. The stress mounted. Life got crazy. To compensate for the lack of oversight, I was allowed to hire and manager interns, a massive step down from my previous role. I presented a candidate to bring on and was overruled by my teammates. The person we brought on was awful, consistently late with no explanations, didn't complete projects on time if at all, wasn't receptive to feedback, etc. My teammates quickly gave up on them and just stopped giving them tasks. I kept giving tasks, providing feedback, giving support, etc. After 3 months of a 4-month internship, I was called into our COO's office and told that I had a management complaint levied against me. The complaint essentially said I was riding the intern too hard, was rude, was curt, and setting unrealistic expectations. I asked for specifics, and none were provided. I turned over dozens of emails and Slack messages showing how I consistently communicated, how I gave constructive feedback, that I provided extra time off when asked, and that I checked in on status offering to review ahead of a deadline or answer questions. Basically, all of my evidence completely rebuked the complaint. The complaint was dismissed by the COO and HR saying it was a bad intern trying to blame their bad work products on someone else. The only additional feedback was, try to be a little nicer in your Slack messages. You're a little direct, and a lot of our staff don't do well with being direct. Following this exchange, my duties were expanded and my teammates now reported to me officially. I softened. I hated my job but trudged through for 7 months. My son was born 6 weeks early and I started pat leave. After 2 weeks, I was asked when I was coming back and if I could move up the date because the team was struggling without me. It was implied that it was my fault that my son came early, leaving the team unexpectedly in a lurch. I was nice and came back early. While I was out, my manager hired a mid-level staffer who was meant to be my first hire. My pat leave interrupted the process, apparently. The person who was hired was massively unqualified. My manager liked their attitude and acknowledged they'd need help. After a month of training, things were worse than I thought. We got to the point where I had to review every email that was sent as he was unable to write an email that wasn't riddled with typos and misinformation. I was kind. I took the time to edit, explain the edits, and tell him how much he was improving. I took him to lunches telling him how much we appreciated his work and how well he was doing. This goes on for 8 months. 8 months of doing 2 jobs. I just started looking for a new job as this one wasn't sustainable with a newborn at home, let alone for my sanity and work-life balance. One Friday, I was working from home and had a pediatrician's appointment at 1:30. I had planned to take the rest of the afternoon off. It was on my calendar and the team knew. I was running out the door when I got a Slack message asking for feedback on a 20-page proposal that was supposed to be drafted 2 days ago by Cobby. I wrote a quick note. Hey, no, I can't review this today. I was on my phone and apparently didn't hit send on the second message. I'm heading to a pediatrician appointment and am offline the rest of the day. I can look at it on Monday. If it's urgent, that is, boss name is asking for it, text me, and I'll look as soon as I'm back from the pediatrician. The employee went to one of our teammates and said that this was evidence that I was deliberately trying to get him fired. They combed through our exchanges over the past 8 months and went to HR. The CEO got involved, reviewing all materials, and my annual review now included my manager at the CEO. I knew this wouldn't be good. The CEO said, "Listen, Fallen Elf, you've done great work here. You've increased revenue. The team is more productive, and the majority of staff say it's great working with you, especially the junior staff. However, you had another complaint filed against you. Clearly, the environment isn't a good fit, so we're going to part ways. This isn't an indictment on your work ethic, simply just a bad personality fit." My manager, former friend, piped in saying, "To clarify, we're firing you. You aren't happy and we're not happy with this complaint. I wanted to be clear and ensure you understood what parting ways meant." The CEO jumped in to say, "I wouldn't put it like that. Your work has been great. I'm happy to serve as a reference for any jobs you're applying for." I had told him I was looking, and make any introductions needed. This isn't about your product. There have just been 2 complaints and we need to act. Even though there's not a lot of meat on either complaint, you understand how people talk. Also, this isn't an immediate separation. We wanted to give you 6 months to look for something new. Take the time to go on interviews, apply for positions, etc. We'll gradually cut back your workload to whatever's needed. We'll also tell staff whatever you want about the separation. If you get a new job, great. If not, we'll handle however you want. My response was, I couldn't agree more on this being a bad personality fit. I work extremely long hours, travel extensively, which was not part of the original contract, get late-night calls from manager name crying and being frantic about goals, people she's conflicting with, on top of the original terms of my employment not being met. I stuck with the position because I believe in the mission, but I've spent too much energy crying from stress and putting on a smiling face for teammates that treat me like. I'm currently a final candidate in 5 searches and expect to get offers within the week. I received 3 of the 5 offers, each with a $30K raise. Once something finalizes, I'll provide 2 weeks' notice. In the meantime, I'm happy to go on the currently scheduled trips as needed and support the team. The CEO was taken aback. Fallen Elf, you're a class act. If you're willing to support these trips, I'd appreciate it. You're demonstrating exactly what I said. It's not personal. In the meantime, just let me know what you need for your search. If you need a few days to process and get sorted, go ahead and tell HR you're working from home. No need to take PTO. We'll pay you out your vacation when you end up leaving. Don't count any job-related stuff as PTO. We left the room and my manager called me into her office asking if I was okay and wanted to talk through anything. I told her we were done. I was tired of her backstabbing and emotional abuse. I can handle being let go, but her actions in the meeting itself were disgusting and in stark contrast to the CEO. I left 3 weeks later with a better job. Story 9. I couldn't sleep. In emergency wards, seeing things, hearing things, awake for 7 days at a stretch. Happened last year I was there. I was also the longest employee. Most PPL lasted 3-4 months at best. I was there 11 years. So my boss gave me a call and said that all the time I was having off, HR were firing me in the next 3 days. So I quit first and kept my unused holiday, etc. Story 10. About 14 years ago, I was binning customer card receipts if they did not want them. LDI supermarket. Data protection started to take off around this time, and my manager called me into the office and I got sacked for breach of GDPR for binning the customer's unwanted card receipts. Apparently, they were supposed to go in the till drop box where the stacks of cash notes got deposited when we had over a certain amount in the till. I was definitely made an example that day for the company. I was never told this and always just went off what the customer said. No, just shot it in the bin, etc. Story 11. Because my disgruntled coworker hated me for reasons that I had nothing to do with, and he ultimately blackmailed the leadership into firing me. Many moons ago, I was hired as a general IT guy for a small logistics brokerage firm. They acted as the go-between to pair short-haul truck drivers switch companies that needed semi-truck-sized deliveries, and I was their combination desktop support and server admin. It was the usual early 2000s small company hodgepodge of tech, an old novel network-run green screen app written in COBOL and delivered to the users via a Citrix app farm. It was hardly the best job I've ever worked, and it came with a significant pay cut, but it was right after the 2001-ish tech crash, so I felt lucky to have a job after months of unemployment. My hiring boss, a guy I'll call Jimmy, was a colleague and peer from my previous job, so I thought things would be fairly smooth sailing, as he and I had a great prior working relationship. What I didn't know at the time was that the reason my job existed was that Jimmy had come in, looked at the existing staff, and determined that 2 of the other IT staffers, who were a couple of good old boys who had been there since the company started, were basically useless deadweight and had sold them that he had in me somebody who could competently do both of their jobs for less than either of them was being paid. Management eventually agreed to this, and while they were supportive, the 4th member of the team, a guy I'll call RC, was pretty much livid that his buddies got let go and blamed me for this. No matter what I tried, I could not get RC to demonstrate anything less than seething contempt for me, especially as I was ramping up on the specifics of what the company's tech stack looked like. He patently refused to answer any questions and ignored my offers to learn and help him with his activities. He even refused to acknowledge when I was making a donut and coffee run and asked if there was anything I could specifically get for him on that. No matter what, I was always going to be the guy who got his friends fired, despite the fact I didn't even find out they existed until I showed up and got a couple of handoff items from them as they were being shown the door. Unfortunately, RC was the guy who had originally written the company's core system. The bulk of his work at that time was porting it from the legacy stack to a Windows Server/SQL Server stack, which meant that to management, and thus also Jimmy, he was completely untouchable. So when we had a network migration that went completely pear-shaped because of telco misconfiguration, he seized the opportunity. While I was pointing out the misconfigured settings on their side of the frame relay connections, he went to the company leadership behind Jimmy's back. I learned afterward from Jimmy that RC told them this showed that I was probably incompetent, and his old friends would have never let this happen. When they hesitated, he then told them that if they didn't fire me that week, he would retire and take all his in-progress work with him, leaving them in the cold with an obsolete system that was breaking under the increasing load their growth was pushing on it, and no way to get off of that system that would cost them a year or more of delays and a fortune in consulting costs. So less than 24 hours after I got the telcos to fix their configuration and declared the migration completed and successful, I was laid off due to revenue shortfalls that were unfortunately caused by our DWAN being down for a week. Story 12. I once got fired because I refused to work off the clock. There were some incoming auto parts that weren't put away by the prior day's team. My boss wanted me and a coworker to put those items away before we clocked in. I said that I would put them away, but only on company time. He said, "Nope, you're fired." I sued him for unemployment benefits, and I won. Story 13. Worked in a company that had 8 workers. Manager leaves, so I'm the acting manager for the department. Now, besides my usual reports for clients, I do invoicing, attending meetings, getting new clients on board, etc. Because I'm only acting manager, there's no financial increase to me. Give social life a break and decide to go all in for the next month until I'm on par or until we get a new manager. My workday is now from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. One morning, due to traffic, I get to the office at 8:15. The director starts throwing his shoes out of the cot that I'm being too tardy and setting a bad example. Gave my 30-day notice, and he promised to increase my pay by 25%. Story 14. I've only been fired once. I was in my 20s. I was working at a now defunct bookstore chain. I was the only employee on for the entire day because they were trying to save money by only scheduling 2 at a time, and the manager had disappeared on me. It was slammed. I was also trying to do inventory, which was supposed to be submitted in a few days. A mystery shopper came in and flunked me because I didn't greet her within whatever minutes of her coming in and didn't offer to sell her a membership when she bought her $3 magazine that it wasn't good towards. No mention of me literally running around trying to help people all by myself. Failing the mystery shop turns out was a fireable offense. Story 15. I have been fired once in my life. I was just starting my career and was the direct assistant to someone who had been with the company for a very long time, Joe. The newly brought in higher-ups were planning on shaking up the business, basically making a bunch of changes to a long-standing successful business to make even more money. One of the things they wanted was to get rid of certain people who had high salaries. Joe had been with the company for a very long time. They were absolutely a dynamic individual and made a lot of money for the company, and they were paid in line with their role. The higher-ups knew that firing Joe would cost them a lot of money. Where I live, you have to have a serious cause to fire someone, and you have to pay them compensation, which increases with tenure. Since it would cost them a lot of money to fire Joe, they tried to make their employment unbearable and force them to quit. They started with little things, moving to a crappier office, micromanagement, etc. They also knew that Joe relied heavily on me as their assistant and that we had a great working relationship. So when everything else didn't work, they fired me. It was without cause, and they did have to give me a very small compensation package. But they knew it would piss off the Joe since they had repeatedly commended me to everyone about what a great job I did. The worst part was they literally fired me the day before Christmas. I was completely blindsided and so upset. I was young and barely scrapping by, so I was so stressed out. In the end, it worked out great for me. Joe ended up getting me into a competing company with personal introductions and recommendations. Joe stayed in touch with me and kept encouraging me in my career. I continued to advance and attended university part-time to upgrade my skills, and I am not working in a senior position for a company I absolutely love. Eventually, the company that fired me completely collapsed, but not before going from one of the most highly regarded companies in our field to the laughingstock. All the cuts the higher-ups made came back to bite them in the ass. Joe left on his own terms about a year after I was fired. He ended up giving them the absolute bare minimum notice, and when he left, thanks to a carefully worded employment contract, took a lot of things that he created within the job with him because they were his property. The collapse of the business started shortly after Joe's departure. Story 16. My trainer told us when I started that because of the location of our line, we didn't have to clock out for lunch, as there wasn't a time clock anywhere nearby. We were told the company would just take the 30 minutes out every day. Fast forward a year later, and I was fired for not clocking out. I tried to explain to them, but I was made an example. But the new regime, they waited a year to say something to me. The other people from my training class had already been fired for other things, and the trainer in question quit a month after I started. Story 17. I got fired once because they replaced the head of IT and he got mad that we never did anything. So I told him most of our work was mental and done before it was reported. He said prove it, so we stopped fixing things before they were reported, and a 5,000 employee company stopped working one day. His bosses reamed his butt when they found out what he did, and he was going to fire everyone, but I took the hit because I already had a job lined up at a competitor. Story 18. Poorly run sandwich shop. They have one person to run the entire kitchen, and they don't even have a good or efficient system. They got mad when I got hit with a crazy lunch rush, and it took 40 minutes for a guy to get a sandwich. The manager told me I need to work like I have a gun to my head, and I basically laughed at him. Guess he didn't like that. I went on to a much better job in no time. Story 19. I was originally on a MF afternoon to close schedule and was told I was temporarily taking Saturday morning with Wednesday off to cover someone who had quit. A few weeks later, I asked the manager when I would be able to switch back to my original schedule or at least move my Wednesday off to Monday. He yelled at me for 5 minutes in front of customers, had me go back to work, and then came back to me 10 minutes later to yell again and fire me. I hadn't had an issue in months, and I was trained on a spot few others were, but I guess the manager wanted to keep dealing with the guy who would get messed up at work and would quit every few weeks. Story 20. Which time? First time I had already accepted another job and told one of my clients, the most annoying one who caught me in a bad mood that day, that I was leaving soon and they'd need to find a new rep, and now was a good time to introduce them. Problem is, I hadn't told my company I was leaving. I was waiting on background and drug screens to come back before I did anything. Well, that customer took it upon themselves to call my boss and ask where I was going and who their rep was. 2 hours later, I was in an office with my boss in HR, and they were telling me I could quit or get fired. I told them they'd have to fire me. I'm not quitting until my new job was secure, and I wanted unemployment in case it fell through. I was walked out about 15 minutes later. New job was great. Second time, I was at help desk, and part of my responsibilities was to manage our backup server. This was back when the backup server was a physical server on site with tons of hard drives, and we had to actively manage the space we used. I ran weekly reports for large files or for files that hadn't been accessed for a few months. One Thursday, I came across a bunch of massive files on the backup from my boss's computer. Turns out it was all, and I'm not here to kink shame, but it wasn't normal. Well, apparently he figured out that I had found the files because the next morning they were all gone. And not gone because he deleted them from his computer. This backup wasn't accessible without a special login, so he went in there and actively deleted the backups and cleared his computer. I hadn't told him I found anything, nor did I keep any proof of what I found. Stupid. Come Monday around 10, he brings the CFO into my office. I'm fired for accessing inappropriate resources on company computers. He had the log of my computer opening the files. All I knew is they were large video files in the backups. I opened a few to see what they were. We were an energy company and no one had any reason for large video files like that. But his report showed my computer opening the files and me being logged into that computer at the time. I'm sure he told the CFO that he opened the files himself later to find out what kind they were. I was escorted off-site by him and HR. I told him I knew what he did in the elevator and that I had proof the files were his. I didn't have proof, but I also didn't want them denying my unemployment claim. This was the tail end of a bad relationship with that boss. He knew I knew too many of his lies to the rest of the company, and I guess was worried I'd turn him in, either to his wife or HR/CEO/CFO. I had no desire to do that. Long story short, my unemployment claim was approved within a week, and I found a better job shortly after. Story 21. I was fired once for not owning my role. Literally had great talks with my director up until the day I was fired. HR just watched as if it was no big deal. What an inhumane bitch she was. Joining that role consisted of me starting a gig with them as their SEO manager, discovering they had been nuking said role every few months and wiping results because the CEO kept implementing ideas that functionally broke the website in Google's eyes and, no pre-existing pipeline to get deliverables done. I was let go the very same week I finally got all our contractors online and dialed in to produce content again. My director constantly redirected me to work on not SEO-related projects. Literally had no idea how SEO functioned, yet was expected to know what to do. I'll never forgive her for being complacent in the firing. Granted, I reamed her so hard in the exit interview she cried, so I suppose I got some revenge there. But in the process, I learned they were lying about their CBD products and the benefits to pets they provide. They basically tweaked the product ever so slightly and claimed it had different benefits as a result. This was not true from a medical standpoint at all. So they were making medical claims that were not backed BT, the ingredients, or the studies resulting from them. The FDA apparently called them dishonest to their faces and were constantly on their ass for this. I live for the day that the FDA discovers that they run a second website that masquerades as a legit product review site, but they just hype their own products because they are paying the vets and guest writers to do so. They literally made a business out of lying to consumers about their pets' health, abusing their employees, and overall being raging S. I'm still recouping from the trauma of losing that job, as my industry went to shortly before I got the role. I almost lost my house that I had finally purchased. It's an awful market for traditional SEO and content writer jobs right now. Thankfully, I'm good at what I do, and I've made myself my own business out of the ashes. But honestly, those people, dishonest scumbags. Story 22. I drove a big truck over a curb. It bottomed out and broke the oil filter. We replaced it and broke it again, lol. It also dented the oil pan where the suction was to circulate the oil. We then drove said truck 45 minutes back to shop with no oil pressure. This was 2 weeks before Christmas. Joke's on them because I won $250K on a $5 scratcher the next week. Ended up buying my own business. Story 23. New job. Busted my ass for about a year and made a bunch of process improvements, including revamping our mailroom print center to keep it running efficiently. Worked OT several times to help with other projects like network switch upgrades and moving our data closets during renovations. Created around a dozen new KB articles for common issues we had that hadn't been documented. That was on top of closing more tickets than the rest of my team. Year-end raises came around, and initially we were told we wouldn't get anything. Management fought, and we got the raise after all, 2% across the board for everyone. I was livid. Called out all the work I did, pointed out the company profits from that year, called out the IT director for never planning and dumping useless busy work on our team, whether it was our responsibility or not. On top of that, they gave me grief for taking time off and working from home for a couple months when my dad's cancer came back. I ripped into them during our team meeting, and after it was done, my bosses called and we mutually agreed it was best for me to leave. Worst place I ever worked, and that includes the call center job I had right after graduating high school. Story 24, a combination of two factors. I had been promoted to a position that was basically a lie. I asked my boss to demote me back to where I'd been, but that would make him look like a bad manager and he didn't want to lose face. And 2, my girlfriend, who worked at the same company, had decided to stop working entirely without telling me so she could get fired and go on EI. So when they fired her, they cleaned house and fired me a few minutes later. The look on her face when she realized what she'd done. Story 25. I guess layoffs aren't really something that counts, but those amount to we're a family. Then the stock goes down and they decide to get rid of some of the family. I did get fired doing B2B sales for Comcast about 10 years ago. I was too honest and wasn't slimy enough to be a salesperson for them. I was highly encouraged, if not ordered, to tell people they didn't have a choice, and TV was included with internet pricing and lie if they ask. And they did, because suddenly it's $20 more than what they saw. Anyway, that is blatantly false because it's itemized and is 100% an add-on. Got put on call restriction by my supervisor to 10 calls, day 5 or more of the 10-day, were Spanish or misrouted calls, and I still had to close 20% of calls based on the 10-day. That lasted 2 weeks before he fired me and stole my stapler, which I purposely had a red one BC of office space. So there was a nice chuckle in the irony of that not being in the box of my stuff that got packed up while I was being let go in the office. Story 26. Back in my college days, I worked at a little family-style Italian restaurant. The money was in being a server, but they didn't have any spots open, so I would start as a greeter and busboy. No worries, just needed some beer money. Nice perk was that we would get a free meal once per shift. The food was awesome, and after a few weeks, the owner head chef would always offer me a beer or glass of wine with the meal. I usually declined, but every now and again I would take him up on the offer. Most of the other employees almost always took him up on the offer. Free booze for college kids. It was an undefined standard practice. This is important later. Anyway, things were going really well. The rest of staff liked me. I liked them. The kitchen staff and I got along great. The owner was always awesome to me. After one of my shifts, the owner lets me know one of the servers will be quitting and if I knew anyone that might want to help out. I was a little slighted that he didn't ask me if I wanted the position, but by that point I had been around long enough and knew how stressed they always were. Not to mention, they did have a decent amount more knowledge about specific dishes, wine pairings, etc. I didn't really want the job, nor did I think I was qualified. I was quite happy where I was. So I let him know I had a buddy that would be interested, and I gave them both the appropriate contact info. Within a week, my buddy was hired. Awesome. Now I can carpool from time to time. A couple of months later, and my buddy and the owner start butting heads. Nothing serious, just heat-of-the-moment stuff. Kitchens can get hectic, tempers flare. I'd seen it before, and I knew I would see it again. But my buddy was going to school for hotel restaurant management, so all of his recent education would always be at the forefront of his mind, and he would constantly be offering suggestions to the owner about how to improve processes. Some were legit, some were pretentious, but, unbeknownst to me, the owner had quickly tired of my buddy's constant criticisms. The fateful evening arrives. Both my buddy and I were on the same shift. Work goes as normal. Owner has a previous engagement, so leaves early, trusting his staff to run normally, which we did as usual. Shift ends and buddy and I get our meals. He gets a glass of wine and pours me one as well. I was a little hesitant because I was driving, but figured, how bad can one glass of wine be? Well, with the foreshadowing heard round the world, that glass of wine got us both fired. I got the call the next day. I was being terminated for stealing a glass of wine. I immediately saw red, and as I was about to unload, a calming peace washed over me. I knew it wasn't about me. It was about my buddy. Owner didn't like the criticism. He found an out to term my buddy, but knew he would have to term me for the same reason, so there would be no issues with preferential treatment. So I just replied to them, "That sucks. Wish it didn't have to be that way." But I understood, and I knew, in the back of my mind, that if I just waited a couple of days, everything would blow over, and I would get that phone call from them asking me to come back. So I waited. And as I waited, I contemplated the entirety of the situation. It was ed up. I was collateral damage. The owner must have had some really thin skin if he didn't like an old college kid offering critiques. And even worse, that he would let a good employee go just to sack what he thought was a bad one. But the thing is, my buddy was great on the floor, knew his customers liked him, upsold the out of the wine. But the owner couldn't get past the criticism. He was making more money with my buddy on shift than without him. But his ego couldn't handle the little whippersnapper that was trying to help him improve the place. So the light bulb went off, and I knew it was just a matter of time before it happened again. A nice early lesson in managing egos. A couple of days later, the call finally did come. Owner was a bit hasty. "We would love for you to come back. We have a shift tonight." In the most polite and calm tone I could muster, I responded, "I appreciate the call, but you burned this bridge. You terminated me for drinking a glass of wine, which is what you offered me almost every shift for the last couple of months. I can't trust that if the owner gets upset with some other employee, that I won't be walked out the door again for the same reason. I enjoyed working there. It really is a shame that it had to end this way. Have a great night." Then I hung up. It felt weird. I just declined a job offer that I really enjoyed. It was incredibly empowering, though, standing up for myself and standing up on principle. Then I went out and got absolutely smashed with my buddy and didn't even have a whiff of a hangover the next morning. All's well that ends well. Story 27. They applied for all the federal relief money when COVID hit. The feds bailed out businesses with the relief money so they wouldn't have to lay anyone off. They held a meeting and patted their own back, saying they were saving all our jobs by applying for this aid and how grateful we should be. After the money came in, there were 2 people in management that showed up with brand new Cadillacs on the same day. Very shortly afterward, they called me and a handful of other hardworking individuals into the office one by one, saying they had to fire us because of COVID and the lack of funds. On my way out, I turned to the guy who coordinated all the debauchery and said, "You know, after something like this happens, it's pretty typical that they will purge some middle management once the herd is thinned too much. They won't want to get rid of any more employees that actually work." He just scoffed and laughed in disbelief. A few months later, I got a text from some former coworkers saying that he got canned out of nowhere, and the owner, who was his father-in-law, would only say things like, "Sometimes things just don't work out," when asked about firing his own SIL. Story 28. I transferred from the Target near my parents' house to one near my college when I went off to school. For some reason, the transfer was taking a while to go through, so they just had me picking up shifts other people didn't want and filling out my timesheets on paper. FTR, picking up someone else's shift required a paper with 3 people's signatures: mine, the person giving away their shift, and the manager on duty. After a couple of weeks, it all got sorted, and I was able to be put on the schedule and punch in as normal. So one day, I show up to work, clock in, and report to my assigned department. I'm doing my usual thing, and the manager on duty comes up to me and goes, "Didn't we fire you?" That was the first I'd heard of it. They took me into the back and tried to say I'd no call, no showed for multiple shifts, except I literally hadn't been assigned shifts other than the few I'd been able to scrounge up manually before that week. Back then, the schedules were always printed out and posted in the back by the break room. So I asked to see the schedules I'd supposedly been on. Whoops, couldn't find them. Then I asked for copies of the shift reassignment paperwork with my signature for the shifts I'd supposedly taken and then skipped out on. What do you know? Can't find that either. They ended up making me sign some disciplinary paper, which I shouldn't have refused, but I was young and honestly freaking the out, and sent me home until they could meet with the HR guy. I called my dad, whose career was retail, and he found the district manager's number and told me to call her before the store manager had a chance to fire me for real. So I did. And in addition to the situation above, I also happened to mention that I hadn't been paid yet for the hours I worked that I'd had to submit manually. Those were the magic words, because when I showed up for my next shift, the HR guy had his tail between his legs. Needless to say, I got unfired pretty quickly. Ended up quitting at the end of the semester, though. That place. Story 29. I was only technically fired. In reality, I was poached. I worked for a company in a certain capacity. A direct competitor learned about the work I was doing at that company and started paying me to share some info about Company A with Company B. I did this based on the contract with Company B that I would eventually work for Company B and that they would pay for my breach of contract for violating my non-compete. They did. Company A fired me about 6 months after I signed the contract with Company B, so I got half a year of double dipping with a salary from both companies. My new salary was better at Company B than at Company A. Both companies broke a lot of laws all the time, and my job was to make it look like they weren't. Story 30. Leaving a door open for the mail to be picked up. It was not the door to my office, but the door to the building. I had done it multiple times as you need a key card to get in, and FedEx, UPS, and USPS were frequently picking up and going. The doors automatically locked at 5 p.m. I left at 4:30 p.m. on Friday and mail wasn't picked up yet, so I left the door ajar with a rock, not the only company to do so. Mail was picked up, but whoever picked it up did not close the door like they had every other time. Building ownership found out and let every tenant have it. Someone's head needed to roll, and because I admitted to it thinking it was a harmless, my head rolled. Story 31. Was a waiter at 17. Overall, I think I did well for the most part, but I did not get along with my manager at all. One day, I got 2 different tables completely mixed up because I came hungover after sleeping like 45 minuets. I worked the morning after my graduation after party and was already stressed as hell by the situation. He told me that I should go for a quick cig break and come back. Coming back, he asked me multiple times if I know what I'm doing, and he basically spoke real slow, like he's speaking to a child, basically taunting me for no obvious reason. Told him I know I messed up, but he doesn't have to be suchy about it. Got a hearing at the end of the shift and was fired after like 2 days. Story 32. Worked in the printing industry for over 8 years as a digital press op tech. I ended up having acute vision loss from an eye disease I was diagnosed with. For a while, I was getting rides with coworkers, but then I had another situation with my only good eye, which kept me home on FMLA for 3 months for recovery. Before FMLA was done, they were hinting at terminating me as soon as I was released back to work. I couldn't drive anymore, and they were unwilling to put me on day shift where I could have had reliable transportation with my dad. Instead, they termed me based on my inability to get to work when they needed me to. City transit wasn't an option as it would have been a 2-hour ride and too late or early getting to work. Plus, Uber would have cost me $25 a ride. I wasn't making enough to afford that, so I was canned instead. Since then, all I can get is part-time work on disability.